Humans have always required shelters to defend against the forces of nature, and against living organisms, including other humans. Some modern shelters, such as tents, are rudimentary and flimsy, only designed to protect against the elements. Lean-tos are similar to tents, but they're much more durable, and can be used to hide in to escape from predators. Then there are shelters, such as houses, cottages, and cabins, which are equipped with amenities such as fireplaces and restrooms, for more comfortable and longer-term dwelling. The most durable modern structures include storm shelters, fallout shelters, military bunkers, and emergency bunkers, like those in the Jurassic Park film, which are all made of a combination of metal and concrete, and are typically built into the ground, or into the sides of hills and cliffs. The combination of thick concrete, metal, and soil composing these structures makes them resistant against being destroyed. The retaining walls outside the entrances of modern bunkers are designed to reduce the amount of debris that accumulates in front of the entrance. These walls, combined with the earth filled in between them, also serve to shield the recessed door from blast impact, and to protect people as they enter and exit the structure from being attacked by enemies. Every variety of shelter, regardless of type or location, shares similarities due to the fact that they serve the same general utility, being protection from external forces, whether it be the forces of nature or against attacks from other living creatures. Cultures of the ancient past also had a need to create shelters similar to those made by modern people. In fact, those who lived in the distant past had a far greater need for well-fortified shelters than people currently do. The structures that archaeologists have discovered, which were constructed thousands of years ago, were made of megaliths and were constructed in a way that generally prevented most of the stones from dislodging over time. Some ancient structures, due to their durability and utility as shelters, were converted by modern soldiers into strongholds, especially during World War II. One such example is a structure in France called Les Petites Monts, which is said to have been initially constructed in the year 4600 BC. Les Petites Monts was built from a combination of megaliths and smaller stones, and it contains several sizable chambers on the inside. This structure would have made an excellent shelter for a large group of ancient people. German soldiers, during the Second World War, recognized the fortification capabilities of this ancient structure, and they converted part of Les Petites Monts into a military stronghold. The ancient structure made an ideal fortification due to its location on top of a hill, providing a panoramic view so that any approaching threats could be seen from far away. The platform on the top of the structure would have allowed people to look out for dangers from an elevated position, keeping them out of reach from being ambushed. The megaliths providing support beneath the smaller stones composing Les Petites Monts are also very durable, and the Germans could have also taken shelter inside the ancient chambers in the case of an attack. The Germans also updated the Roman fortress of Alderney in the British Islands to use as a fortification during World War II, since it was a pre-existing, well-fortified structure, strategically placed to monitor for enemies. The fact that the ancient structure of Les Petites Monts in France was also updated to be used as a fortification by the Germans during World War II reveals that they recognized the structure as an ancient fortress also. Even though mainstream archaeologists believe that Les Petites Monts was not used as a fortress when it was created several thousands of years ago, the German soldiers who were actually trained in combat and had experience building defensive structures realized that Les Petites Monts was a fortress that they could utilize, in the same way that the ancient people had used the structure as a stronghold. Most of Les Petites Monts did not even need to be altered for the Germans' purposes, as the majority of the original structure was left intact, and only relatively small additions were built by the Germans, with doorways leading from the German-built sections to the ancient sections in the interior, so that the Germans could go into the ancient sections if they needed to, since the ancient portions were very well fortified and very useful for storage or in the case of an attack. In addition to converting ancient structures into fortifications, the Germans during the Second World War created bunkers that strongly resemble ancient megalithic structures, even though they're entirely German creations, with no noticeable ancient components. The Wolfslayer bunker in Poland is a unit of several massive freestanding concrete bunkers, composed of 6.5-foot thick steel-reinforced concrete. An explosive was even detonated inside of one of the Wolfslayer buildings at one point, and the building survived, while the furniture inside was destroyed, showing how durable the structure was, if it could survive the explosion with no damage to the thick walls on the inside. The Wolfslayer complex was camouflaged from enemy soldiers by a dense cover of trees, which hid the structures from aerial view, as well as from the ground. Ancient shelters across the world also made use of thick megalithic walls and ceilings, which would have made these structures as durable as the Wolfslayer bunkers, if not even more durable. Concrete causes the metals it comes in contact with, such as steel and iron, to degrade rapidly, mainly due to the presence of high chloride levels in concrete. Thermal cracking occurs when metal expands and contracts repeatedly due to temperature changes, leading to degradation. When iron or steel corrodes, the resulting rust occupies a greater volume than the steel or iron. This expansion creates tensile stresses in the concrete, which can eventually cause cracking, delamination, and spalling. Therefore, even the strongest steel-reinforced concrete, such as that which the Wolfslayer bunkers are composed of, is much weaker than the types of stone used to build ancient structures. The reason why the megaliths that ancient people built with do not degrade in the same way as concrete is because the stone in these ancient structures do not contain metal beams or rebar, and therefore there is no metal inside to corrode and wear away the stone. The downside to using solid stone in building projects, however, is that it's generally far more difficult to acquire large amounts of rock and to cut and move megaliths into shape. This is why modern builders rely on materials such as concrete and metal, because they're far easier to transport and mold into shape. Ancient people would not have created buildings from megaliths unless they had an important reason for doing so. They could have instead created structures of the same size and shape from other materials that were more accessible. The reason why ancient builders made such a large number of structures across the world out of megaliths is because they required structures that were as durable as possible, due to a combination of threats from other people, dangerous predatory creatures, and extreme natural disasters far worse than the modern world experiences. Ancient people needed shelters, bunkers, and fortifications to protect their lives. The dolmen of Menga in Spain is an example of a well-fortified megalithic structure that could have served as a bunker for people in the ancient past. The structure was created from megalithic blocks of stone and had been buried under large mounds of soil, which helps to camouflage the structure and to hold it in place. The interior is fully reinforced by megaliths to make the structure resistant to any type of force that could potentially impact it. And the chambers are spacious enough for a large group of people to take shelter inside in the case of an emergency, such as an attack or a natural disaster. The same types of structures are found across the world, ranging from nearly every country in continental Europe to Japan and elsewhere. These ancient shelters are very similar in appearance to bunkers created more recently in history, since both the ancient and modern structures each serve the same utility. It is apparent that the ancient fortifications are far more durable than recently constructed shelters, due to the fact that natural processes alone have degraded the modern bunkers in only a few decades, whereas the fortifications, which are several thousands of years old, are overall still intact and functional. The modern structures made of metal and concrete will have almost fully deteriorated in several thousands of years, by contrast. Another variety of megalithic structure, also referred to as a dolmen by archaeologists, is smaller in stature and freestanding, but is still very well fortified. These dolmens usually have a very small, round entrance, which is just large enough for a person to slip through. The design of these dolmens is similar to that of modern bird nesting boxes, which have very small, round entrances, designed to prevent predators from reaching inside and attacking the birds. Although these dolmens were created for humans to use, and not birds, they function in the same way as a bird nesting box, to ensure the safety of anyone inside. There are hundreds of thousands of dolmens across the world, with the largest concentrations being found in Europe and Asia, including India. Most dolmens across the world are dated to have been built between 2500 BC and 4000 BC, making them between 4,500 and 6,000 years old. Ancient people spent much of their time outdoors, significantly more than their modern counterparts. Since they were outside so often, potentially dangerous creatures could approach and attack them at any time. It would therefore be in their best interest to have small but sturdy shelters, strategically stationed in the wilderness, in the event that something might approach them that they would need to quickly hide from. Modern hunters hide inside of fabric or plastic structures to stay out of view of their targets. In this sense, these modern structures are for the opposite purpose of what the ancient dolmens were used for. In the ancient past, humans were concerned about being hunted by the larger creatures that once existed, while they themselves were hunting for smaller prey, so they needed somewhere to quickly conceal themselves in the wild. Instead of needing to hide to not scare off animals, ancient people hid inside of these structures when they were scared. The damage that's apparent on these structures is clearly from more than just natural erosion. Some of these dolmens show evidence of having been impacted, leaving the dolmens fractured, misshapen, and with debris scattered about. Many of these dolmens even appear to have been struck from a specific angle. They may have either been hit by a larger creature attempting to attack the structure, or they may have been struck by natural forces, such as flooding, which also seems to have left many of these dolmens partially buried in thick layers of sediment. The dirt that they were partially embedded in has since been removed so that the entire structure could be seen again. The fact that the dirt had once covered the entrances indicates that these structures were not intentionally buried. Many of these structures have stone walls, which protrude outwards from the front entrance, which would have blocked the view of outside predators, and also prevented attackers from rushing in and blocking the entrance to the dolmen before the humans could go inside and take shelter. With these protective walls, people would feel more comfortable sitting outside their shelter and possibly cooking food. Often, there are gaps in the structure of dolmens, which may have been used for ventilation, so that people could cook food inside, instead of having to cook out in the open and increase the risk of being attacked. These types of dolmens seem to have been intended to be used as longer-term shelters, and may have been comparable to a cabin. The same types of structures are very common in Russia, with many being more well-designed than those elsewhere. Some of these larger dolmens have entrances that are slightly larger and more accessible, which may indicate that these were entered more frequently, and therefore it would be practical to make the dolmen slightly easier to enter. Dolmens in Italy, France, Spain, and elsewhere have a similar design to those in Russia, demonstrating the effectiveness and universal necessity of these structures in the past. Some dolmens, for example those in France, are even large enough for a group of people to take shelter in, and they're very similar to the longhouses built by Native Americans more recently in history, except that the ancient dolmens are made of megaliths. Archaeologists claim that these types of dolmens were used as tombs. It is not plausible, however, considering that no bodies or burial goods were found inside of any of these types of dolmens. If you take into account that some of these dolmens are too small to have placed a body inside lengthwise, and that the bodies would therefore need to be contorted to fit inside completely, the theory is put into doubt that these types of dolmens were used as tombs. There is another type of structure that archaeologists refer to as a dolmen. These megalithic constructions were clearly not used to entomb human remains either, because there would have been no protection from the elements, predators, or grave robbery due to insufficient shielding. These dolmens resemble something in particular, of which most people have not made the connection. I will be explaining the purpose of these types of dolmens in an upcoming video. In Scotland, there is a structure of a similar design to the fully enclosed dolmens, but it's carved directly from a single megalith, instead of being built from several large stones. The structure, named Dwarfy Stane, is hollowed out on the inside to form a very sturdy shelter. The structure has been dated to have been built between 2500 and 3500 BC, or 4500 to 5500 years ago. The inside of Dwarfy Stane is spacious enough to serve as a long-term shelter, with apparent sections carved out for sleeping and sitting. Other ancient structures, which archaeologists admit were used as dwellings long ago, such as the Guyaju caves in China, have the same type of rock-cut beds that people had once used to sleep on in Dwarfy Stane. While the Guyaju caves were used to provide a large group of people with shelter, Dwarfy Stane seems to have been a shelter for only 1 or 2 people. Situated in front of the entrance, there is a large stone that seems to have served as a barricade to protect anyone inside the structure from being attacked directly. Dwarfy Stane would have provided a very solid defense against attackers due to its megalithic construction and design. As with each of the other megalithic shelters discussed previously, most archaeologists hold the belief that Dwarfy Stane was constructed to be a tomb. However, as with the dolmens also, no remains have been discovered inside the structure, meaning that it was never used as a tomb. In addition to resembling a residential structure, Dwarfy Stane is also very reminiscent of rectangular pillbox bunkers constructed during World War II and used to defend against attacks from enemy soldiers. Dwarfy Stane would have been even more durable than these modern structures, since it's made of solid stone instead of concrete and rebar, and the lack of openings on the structure, apart from the entrance, make it even safer. In a previous video on this channel, I had explained that many ancient structures had become partially or fully buried under dense layers of soil during a worldwide cataclysm just over 4,350 years ago, which was caused by extreme tectonic shifting, which in turn resulted in earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and most notably, tidal waves and major flooding across the world, from which the accounts of a worldwide flood in hundreds of ancient documents stems from. It is possible that most of these ancient structures that appear to have been intentionally buried may have been buried naturally by the ancient flooding. Apart from defending against ancient creatures, which had once been much more formidable than those existing currently, ancient people may have constructed these buildings in part to defend against these natural disasters. Major earthquakes are generally preceded by many smaller ones, due to the progressively shifting tectonic plates. Even a few centuries prior to the major tectonic shifting that resulted in the worldwide flood, there may have been a series of smaller earthquakes, which would have also resulted in smaller-scale tsunamis and flooding across the world. This would have prompted the ancient people to start building structures that they thought could protect them from these disasters. Hence the abundance of megalithic structures across the world. Polygonal masonry was also used to construct ancient buildings worldwide, due to the fact that this arrangement of interlocking stones is the most stable in the event of tectonic activities. In most regions across the world, the pre-cataclysmic people were concerned about both natural disasters, predators, and war, which is why they built enormous walls made of megaliths. For example, the ancient stone walls that still exist in Peru today, which were also resistant against earthquakes and other types of impacts. The pre-cataclysmic structures in Baalbek, Lebanon, are composed of megalithic blocks, which are very sturdy and difficult to break or topple. Below these megaliths, however, there are many smaller blocks of stone. These smaller blocks function as what are known as base isolators in architecture. Base isolators are a collection of special units in a building, resting on its foundation, which provides separation of the structure from the ground. Base isolators act as shock absorbers between the building and the ground motion. They allow the structure to rock back and forth slightly while remaining upright during a quake. This causes the force to be dispersed more evenly throughout the structure and prevents the buildings from fracturing due to stress. The occurrence of smaller earthquakes and flooding before the historic worldwide flood is also supported by ancient documents. The ancient pre-Chinese civilization, dating to the 3rd millennium BC, has records of an event in which the entire region, but not the whole world, was flooded, forcing the people who lived in this flooded region to retreat to the tops of the tallest hills around, which they referred to as islands in the presence of the deep floodwaters. This regional flood wiped out much of the population, and after the floodwaters retreated, the surviving people attempted to fortify their cities against the upcoming, more severe flood that they feared would eventually occur. This Chinese document is not the only account of such an event. Another ancient document located within the Septuagint, named Sefer HaYeshar, often referred to as the Book of Jasher, gives another account of a smaller disaster that preceded the worldwide flood. According to Jasher, as a warning that God was going to flood the entire earth to eliminate the corrupted people and creatures that dominated the world, God flooded 1/3 of the earth. This smaller flood may have only impacted the regions bordering the rivers, lakes, and oceans, as the water levels temporarily but drastically increased, amounting in total to 1/3 of the landmass. Several generations following the smaller flood that affected 1/3 of the earth, there was another, far greater flood that encompassed the entire earth, caused by the climax of tectonic activity across the world. After the smaller flood that affected only 1/3 of the earth, and prior to the worldwide flood, the advanced pre-cataclysmic civilizations across the world, who knew about the 1/3 of the earth that had been flooded, attempted to defend against the coming worldwide apocalypse by creating structures that they thought could protect them. Additionally, there are ancient documents describing major earthquakes in Egypt. These ancient earthquakes were referred to as the hammers of God. After experiencing these tectonic disasters, the pre-Egyptians constructed buildings specifically designed to withstand earthquakes. They also built specialized wells, which were used to predict when an earthquake was soon to occur, which became increasingly more necessary as the tectonic activity progressively worsened. Modern scientists use a similar method to determine when major earthquakes will occur and when volcanoes are going to erupt. For example, Yellowstone is monitored for signs of volcanic activity by Yellowstone Volcano Observatory scientists, who detect earthquakes using seismographs and ground motion using GPS. Precursors to volcanic eruptions include strong earthquake swarms and rapid ground deformation, gradually increasing in magnitude until the volcano erupts. According to modern architects, the most durable shapes that structures can be, in order to defend against the impact of earthquakes as well as strong winds and tsunamis, are domes and pyramids. The Transamerica Pyramid is a skyscraper that was built in San Francisco, California in 1972, which was specifically designed to withstand the severe earthquakes that California often receives. The ancient people across the world may have constructed pyramidal buildings for the same purpose, in order to withstand major earthquakes. Modern schools, churches, and other institutions, especially in the south-central and southwestern United States, are often constructed in the shape of a wide, flattened dome to withstand earthquakes as well as tornadoes. A wide array of ancient structures in Ireland were built in the same shape. They have a domed roof and straight walls surrounding the base of the structure, in the same way that modern domed buildings have straight walls. These walls are reinforced with megaliths in the case of the ancient mounds, in order to protect inhabitants. These mounds seem to have been intentionally buried at the time that they were initially constructed, in order to fortify the structures and to give them their domed shape. These large mounds of earth contain spacious stone chambers beneath them, which many people could take shelter inside of. These structures are dated to have been built between 3200 BC to 2900 BC, which is around 5200 to 4900 years old. The most notable ancient mounds in Ireland are the Noath and Newgrange mounds. The Noath mounds in particular are notable because at this location, there's over a dozen smaller mounds surrounding a very large central mound. These structures may have once served as shelters for a larger group of people, with the central mound possibly being the residence of the most influential people in the community. There are many other mound structures of the same variety across Ireland. The entrances are usually fairly small, to prevent attackers from reaching the inhabitants inside. Mainstream archaeologists refer to these ancient mounds as tumuli, which are burial mounds. If these ancient mounds were used as tombs, then what are these modern structures? They're schools, not tombs. Mainstream archaeologists believe that the vast majority of ancient structures were either tombs or temples. Modern structures do not only consist of tombs and temples, they also consist of other types of buildings, including schools, hospitals, stores, government institutions, and houses. Yet archaeologists assert that ancient societies rarely, if ever, built these other types of structures, and that nearly every building that ancient people created were tombs or temples. Ancient people required buildings for themselves to live in, whereas they did not require tombs or temples. They would not have created thousands of temples and tombs, while facing a significant lack of structures for themselves to live in. In Italy, there are ancient structures that share the same shape as the mounds in Ireland, as well as modern domed buildings, which may have served as shelters in the distant past. These megalithic buildings are the size of small cottages, and each of these structures would have made an excellent shelter for large groups of ancient people. They are made entirely of durable megalithic stones, and are very reminiscent of Cold War bunkers constructed in the mid to late 1900s AD in Albania, as well as pillbox bunkers used by World War II soldiers, and nuclear bunkers created after World War II in the United States. As discussed before, dome-shaped buildings are the most durable against the widest range of disasters, and the fact that these ancient dome-shaped shelters in Italy were made of megalithic blocks of stone makes them even more durable than the similarly shaped modern structures, built out of concrete and rebar. The layout of these structures indicates that this site may have been comparable to a neighborhood in the distant past. Each of these shelters faced the artificially created river that had once been filled with fresh flowing water long ago, so that the inhabitants would not need to stray far from their homes for resources. Despite the fact that mainstream archaeologists refer to this site as the Etruscan necropolis, there is no evidence that these structures were ever used as tombs, as no bodies have been discovered inside. The only objects discovered inside include mirrors, vases, and jewelry, which points more towards people having lived inside these structures at one time. The reason why there's no household goods or other objects currently inside of these ancient structures is because they either decomposed since they were made of materials that are less durable than rock, or because over time, the objects have been removed by archaeologists and plunderers. Most of these ancient shelters would have initially had doors. However, it would usually be impractical to make the door out of stone, since it would be very difficult to move by hand. Therefore, the doors would have been made of a lighter material, such as wood. As with the other household goods that were inside of these structures when they were used thousands of years ago, these doors have either decomposed, or they were taken to be put into museums and preserved, as some doors on ancient structures in Egypt were. Many other ancient structures around the world may have simply not required any doors though, such as the dolmens, which have the smaller entrances, for the same reason why birdhouses don't need doors, because the very small entrance already serves to keep predators out. There are rock-cut beds and benches inside the pre-cataclysmic stone shelters in Italy as well, which would have served as very durable furniture for the ancient people who resided in these structures. Ancient people were hardier and more robust than modern people, and they didn't mind sleeping on stone beds and sitting on stone seats, since they had more important concerns than whether they were as comfortable as possible. There would have been no need for seats or beds if these structures were used as tombs. Most importantly, if they were tombs, archaeologists would have found the remains of deceased people in coffins, of which there were never any. Some of these pre-cataclysmic Etruscan shelters, rather than being freestanding structures, were carved directly into the ground or into rock, with a rectangular entrance, once again looking very similar in appearance to modern shelters. There are similar ancient structures at the site of Tharsa in Turkey. These shelters were built deep into the ground, and they also have stone-cut furniture inside. These structures had been completely buried by the natural disasters that occurred in the distant past, just as the dolmens in Russia and other ancient structures across the world were. Since the Tharsa structures were completely buried, with the entire structures, including the doors, being underground, no one knew that they existed just below the surface until very recently. The excavation of these structures was only initiated in May of 2022, meaning that prior to this year, no one had seen inside of these structures, causing one to wonder what other ancient structures could be lying just below the surface, anywhere across the world. Along with the sediment that was removed from inside of these structures, archaeologists discovered pottery and an assortment of household goods of the same type found in the pre-cataclysmic shelters in Italy. However, no human remains were found inside of any of these structures. The Tharsa structures were designed to protect inhabitants from attackers, but they were not designed to protect against flooding. When the worldwide flood began, these structures would have begun to fill up with water and mud. This would have caused anyone inside the structure to flee outside, so that they would not drown when the structure had been completely filled with water, leaving their household goods inside the structures until they were removed by archaeologists. This is the reason why no bodies were found inside the Tharsa structures, even though they had been used as shelters in the distant past. Another set of ancient shelters were discovered in Turkey in the 1960s, which are known as the Derinkuyu and Kaymakli underground complexes. These structures are very spacious, with Derinkuyu extending over 85 meters, or almost 280 feet, underground, and Kaymakli extending over 40 meters, or 131 feet, underground. Estimates say that Derinkuyu alone is capable of sheltering over 20,000 people at once, while Kaymakli is capable of sheltering over 5,000 people. Both of these complexes have air ventilation shafts and water wells to enable occupants to live inside long-term. The entrances to these structures are small and difficult to locate, making them excellent hidden shelters. In fact, Derinkuyu was only accidentally discovered in 1963 during construction work. Both the Derinkuyu and Kaymakli subterranean complexes were used as shelters during the Arab-Byzantine Wars during the Middle Ages, but the earliest records of these underground structures dates back to approximately 3000 BC. The Derinkuyu and Kaymakli complexes are the ancient equivalents of modern underground community shelters, which are designed to provide thousands of people with a safe place to go in the event of an invasion or some other major cataclysm. Several of these were created in the United States during the Cold War. The Greenbrier Bunker in West Virginia was designed for members of Congress to retreat to in the case of an emergency. The bunker was a secret from the public from its construction in 1958 to 1992, when a reporter from the Washington Post wrote an article about it without permission, revealing it to the public. And the Greenbrier Bunker was no longer able to be used by Congress, since its location had been disclosed. The Derinkuyu and Kaymakli bunkers in Turkey were also well hidden, so that attackers would not be able to find the people who were hidden underground. These ancient structures are also very similar to the modern luxury survival condo in Kansas in the United States, which was built for wealthy individuals to escape to in the event of a catastrophe. The survival condo extends over 60 meters or 197 feet underground, with enough space for 75 people to live inside comfortably, as well as enough supplies to survive for decades. Far larger than the survival condo in Kansas are the Cold War-era community bunkers located across Switzerland. These bunkers are large enough to shelter 20,000 people each, giving each of them the exact same capacity as the Derinkuyu community bunker in Turkey, making the ancient bunkers in Turkey even more similar to modern fallout shelters. They're equipped with round stone doors weighing half a ton each, which could be rolled in front of the entrances, in the same way that large round doors are used to seal fallout shelters as a defensive measure. Large structures created for rulers and government officials in the pre-cataclysmic past also needed to be well fortified, both against potential attackers and against natural disasters. The complex of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, for example, has many different layers of protection. The large moat surrounding the complex, as well as the megalithic wall, are similar to the fortification strategies that modern fortresses, such as Fort Stanwix in New York and the Caerlaverock Castle in Scotland, utilize also. The Osaka Castle in Japan is built upon the remains of a pre-cataclysmic megalithic fortress, with enormous walls reaching 24 to 25 meters high, and a moat surrounding the ancient walls of the fortress. attackers would have had much difficulty traversing the large moat and then scaling the enormous walls to reach the people who were taking refuge within the fortress. Another method of fortification that some modern castles, forts, and military bunkers have utilized is elevation, primarily by building these structures into the sides of cliffs. During World War I, a military shelter was constructed into the side of a mountain named Monte Cristo. This refuge is located at an astonishing 2,760 meters, or over 9,000 feet above ground level. The shelter is the same color as the mountain, making it very difficult to see from a distance. Italian soldiers had used the shelter during the First World War to escape from the Austro-Hungarian forces at the base of the mountain. Likewise, the Prajama Castle, constructed in the 1100s AD, as well as the Burg Krafenstein Castle, constructed in the 1300s AD, were embedded into the sides of cliffs, high above ground level, in order to protect inhabitants from invaders. Many ancient structures use the same tactic to protect inhabitants. The Lycian cliffside dwellings in Turkey are one such example. A large number of these buildings were in the process of being carved, and many were unable to be finished before the Great Cataclysm occurred and halted the projects. As with many of the other megalithic shelters across the world, there are stone-cut seats and beds inside of these buildings, indicating that they were built to be lived in and not used as tombs. These structures would have been capable of sheltering hundreds of people, and potentially many more, if the construction of all of these buildings had been completed. The cliffside structures in Vardzia, Georgia, are another example of ancient rock-cut structures that could have sheltered thousands of people. There are stone-cut beds and benches inside of each of the Vardzia structures, as well as doors and staircases to navigate to other rooms and levels. The Vardzia structures were converted into a monastery in the 1100s AD, when minor additions composed of small bricks and mortar were also added, giving the illusion that the entire structure had been created in the 1100s AD, when the vast majority was actually created several thousands of years ago. Similar structures were created by pre-cataclysmic people in Japan for the purpose of concealment and sleeping in. The Yoshimi Hyakuwana rock-cut shelters in Japan are a collection of over 200 small rooms carved into the sides of cliffs. Each of these structures are the ideal size for hiding oneself away from dangers, and especially for sleeping in at night. They're very similar to modern-day facilities called capsule hotels, which are coincidentally the most popular in Japan. In these hotels, people are given small, individual capsules to sleep in. Although there's not much room, they are functional and comfortable. The same can be said of the Yoshimi Hyakuwana. Even though mainstream archaeologists assert that these structures were used as tombs, the beds present on the inside, as well as their similar appearance to other ancient structures that were used as dwellings, and the fact that modern Japanese people often sleep in similar structures, indicates that the Yoshimi Hyakuwana were used as shelters by ancient people. As discussed earlier in the video, the Guyaju ancient cliff dwellings in China are another example of elevated shelters that ancient people built into the sides of cliffs in order to protect inhabitants. Although the entrances are small, the interiors are spacious. There are makeshift beds and ledges carved into the stone of these structures also, further indicating that these and other structures across the world that share the same features were used as shelters. Some cliffside and hillside shelters are located at ground level, rather than being elevated. Modern military bunkers in Switzerland, for example, are almost indistinguishable from pre-cataclysmic structures. The entrances of these bunkers are often difficult to see, and the bunkers appear to be nothing more than natural rock formations. The military actually did this intentionally, in order to disguise the bunkers from invaders. The stone that these bunkers are carved into also serves as an important layer of protection against attacks. The ancient Apurimac structures in Peru are very similar in appearance to modern military bunkers. These structures are well fortified and difficult to spot from a distance, as the natural cliff face was left uncarved, so as to not draw attention to the structures. And once again, the benches and ledges, carved directly into the stone, seems to indicate that the structures were once used as dwellings, not tombs. And some of these structures were repurposed as prisons by the conquistadors in the 16th century AD, since they were so well fortified. Across the world in England, there are ancient rock-cut structures named the Derbyshire Hermit's Caves. The openings are small enough so that large creatures could not enter, but the ledges, doorways, and windows are open enough so that occupants could see threats and even ward off attackers if necessary. Originally, these windows were even smaller and more well-refined. However, erosion from the worldwide flood, as well as general weathering over thousands of years, has worn away much of the rock. The interior is spacious, and there's many rooms inside, indicating that the structure could have housed many people. As with the Vardzia shelters in Georgia, the Derbyshire Hermit's Caves were repurposed as a place of worship in the 1300s AD, hence the crudely carved crucifixion imagery on the walls. The structures themselves are far older though, dating as far back as 3000 BC, roughly the same age as Stonehenge. The ancient fortress of Sigiriya in Sri Lanka is situated on top of a natural plateau composed of granite that's over 180 meters or almost 600 feet tall. The height of the structure is far taller than any living creature, giving the people who resided on top almost complete protection from being attacked. The fortress of Sigiriya is very similar to Machu Picchu in Peru, which was constructed on the peak of the Andes mountain. Machu Picchu is situated almost 8,000 feet above sea level and is in a completely secluded location, making it a very secure place for ancient people to reside. Machu Picchu and Sigiriya are very reminiscent of a fortress in Israel named Masada, which was created on the top of a natural plateau 434 meters or 1,400 feet tall between the dates of 37 and 31 BC, under the supervision of Herod the Great. Around 100 years after Masada was created, the fortress was sieged by Roman soldiers in order to eliminate the last remnants of the Great Revolt, who were hiding on top of the plateau. The rebels had removed the means by which they had reached the top in order to prevent the Romans from climbing up and attacking them. The Romans built a large ramp made of soil and rocks to reach the top of the plateau, which took them several months to complete. The amount of effort that the Romans had to put in to reach the top of Masada demonstrates how well protected these fortresses on top of plateaus were. Since Sigiriya and Machu Picchu are at higher elevations than Masada, it would have been even more difficult for any attackers to reach those who were hiding out at these locations. Archaeologists struggle to explain the original purpose of these structures because they're in denial of the fact that life in the ancient past was not quite as peaceful as documentary channels would have you believe, and in denial of the actual timeline of human history. The megalithic structures that were built thousands of years ago survived due to the fact that they were designed to withstand catastrophes and attacks, and they were even more well-made than modern bunkers and shelters. This video was produced with the generous support of my Patreon community. Debbie, Jeffrey Schellenberg, Joseph Thompson, Ablobonic, Adam Walker, Liam Flatley, The Biggest Birdie, Nathaniel Lee, Top Secret, Alvaro Aguayo, and Jacob Jirasek. And thank you also to those who have supported Shattered History with YouTube's Super Thanks option.